In exchange for the gauge, Silas would build the blacksmith a sturdy pine box for his tools. The colonial economy was fueled by these professional relationships and bartered goods, often more so than by coin. A skilled craftsman earned not just wages, but a reliable network of services, ensuring that even in times of tight money, his family would be clothed, fed, and supplied with tools. Refreshed, Silas returned to the demanding task of cutting the intricate dovetails for the mahogany drawers, the mark of true craftsmanship. It required a steady hand, a sharp chisel, and absolute geometric certainty. The afternoon was dedicated to making every joint disappear.
Not speed, but the quality of his joins. The dovetail joint, connecting the sides of the drawers for Mr. Sterling's mahogany chest, was the ultimate statement of skill. A perfect dovetail required the pins and tails to fit so tightly that they needed no glue, only friction and force to hold them together, a joint that would last centuries. Silas worked silently for hours, his focus absolute. He cut the joints using a frame saw, carefully removing the waste wood with a series of razor-sharp chisels. His body was tense, hunched over the workbench, his breath held during the crucial cuts. The inspection. The rhythm of the shop came to a sudden halt at 3 o'clock when Mr. Sterling himself arrived. The wealthy merchant, dressed in fine imported cloth, swept into the dusty workshop, his demeanor demanding immediate attention. Master Thayer met him, his face a careful mask of respectful professionalism. "Mr. Sterling, the mahogany chest is ready for your inspection." The inspection was a nerve-wracking event. The client was not just buying an object, he was buying status and assurance of quality. He ran a gloved hand over the newly polished top surface. He inspected the rear panel, often the area where a less honest craftsman might skimp on quality. Then came the drawers, Silas's domain. Mr. Sterling pulled the first drawer out and then slowly slid it back in. The movement was silent, smooth, and even. He repeated the action with the second, then the third, and finally the 2 drawers Silas had completed this morning. He paused, testing the joints with his fingers. "The joinery is excellent, Thayer. Strong. I can find no fault with the slide or the grain matching." Silas felt a wave of relief so intense it was almost physical. A single sticky drawer or a warped panel could have meant weeks of unpaid rework and a substantial loss for Master Thayer. "The hinges are brass, imported from London as requested," Master Thayer assured him, pointing to the delicate, shining hardware. The merchant nodded, satisfied. He pulled out a heavy purse of coin, hard currency, and counted out the agreed-upon sum plus a small bonus for timely completion. The transaction was more than just a sale. It was the affirmation of the shop's reputation, which was its most valuable asset. The artisan's role in society. The cabinet maker was highly valued in colonial society. Unlike the frontier farmer who simply provided sustenance, the artisan provided refinement and civilization. Furniture was a symbol of permanence and wealth in a new land. Master Thayer's shop was building the material culture of the colonies. After Mr. Sterling departed, the atmosphere in the shop lightened considerably. The money was divided. A substantial amount immediately went to pay the supplier for the mahogany, another portion for taxes and rent, and a small fixed weekly wage for Silas. Apprentice's evening task. As dusk approached, the light dimmed, making the precision work impossible. The final 2 hours of the workday were dedicated to preparing for the next day. Apprentice Thomas's duty now shifted to gluing and pressing. He mixed the hot hide glue, a process that required careful temperature control, and began applying it to the large panels Master Thayer was preparing for a simple desk. The heavy pieces were then clamped with massive wooden screw presses, where they would remain overnight to dry. Meanwhile, Silas worked on a small, less demanding personal project, a tool chest for himself. This was common practice. Artisans often used their downtime to create the tools and storage they needed, which were too expensive to purchase ready-made. He was also subtly practicing new techniques, experimenting with designs that he hoped would define his own style when he finally opened his shop. By 8 o'clock, the shop was swept clean, tools oiled and locked away, and the massive door secured with a heavy iron bar. The day demanded everything they had, transforming raw wood into beautiful, functional objects. Silas extinguished the single tallow candle, the smell of burnt wax replacing the scent of sawdust. He climbed the stairs, the exhaustion a welcome weight. The tyranny of perfection had been met, and for another day he had upheld the high standards of his craft. The evening hours for Silas were not filled with leisure. While a farmer's work might cease entirely after dark, a craftsman's day often extended into the night for critical tasks, bookkeeping, design work, and continuous self-improvement. The geometry of the trade. Silas had achieved his journeyman status through skill, but advancing to master required both capital and advanced intellectual knowledge. After a quick solitary supper of bread and stew, Silas settled down with a geometry book and a drawing compass. The colonial artisan was often the most literate and mathematically skilled members of the community. Success in cabinetry required a deep understanding of perspective, drafting, and complex geometry to calculate angles for curved pieces like chair backs or staircase railings. He was currently studying the principles of Rococo design, a popular style imported from Europe, characterized by asymmetry and fluid shell-like curves. This knowledge was his competitive edge. To satisfy the wealthy clientele of Philadelphia, he couldn't just build functional boxes. He had to build fashionable, complex art pieces. He drew late into the night, sketching intricate pediments and curved legs, translating two-dimensional geometry into three-dimensional forms. Guilds and social standing. While Philadelphia lacked the strict, formalized guilds of old Europe, the master craftsmen maintained strong social and professional associations. Master Thayer was a member of the Carpenters' Company of Philadelphia, an association that regulated standards, set apprentice policies, and provided a platform for political influence. As a journeyman, Silas attended meetings less formally, but he understood the importance of networking. The artisans formed a distinct middle class in the colonies, not nobility and not laborers, but men who earned their living through specialized skill. They frequented the coffee houses, the colonial equivalent of modern social media. These were vibrant, smoky hubs where merchants, lawyers, and artisans gathered to discuss business, trade routes, and politics. One evening, he overheard a vigorous argument between a merchant and a printer about the heavy duties imposed by Britain on imported paper. "The king controls what we read and what we build," the printer fumed. "The tax is a deliberate act to suppress local industry and thought." Silas listened intently. The taxes hurt Thayer's business directly, increasing the cost of mahogany and brass. The sense of grievance among the city's tradesmen was palpable. They weren't fighting for land, but for the right to conduct their craft and commerce freely. The journeyman's dream. Silas often walked past a small vacant shop near the docks, a shop he dreamed of renting. The central dilemma of his life was money. He needed capital. For tools, acquiring a full set of master-grade planes, saws, and chisels. Rent and stock, paying the first year's rent and stocking expensive woods like walnut and cherry. Hiring an apprentice, necessary for the labor-intensive work of a new shop. His wages barely allowed him to save a few shillings a month. He knew his greatest leverage was his skill. He contemplated approaching a wealthy patron, perhaps one of Master Thayer's clients, to sponsor him, offering a cut of his future profits in exchange for the initial investment. As he walked back to his meager rented room, the city was dark, lit only by scattered lanterns. He thought of the chest he had perfected today and the designs he had just sketched. His hands were his passport. His tools were his army. The future was precarious, but the desire to be his own master, to put his own name above a shop door, was a relentless driving force that made every early morning and late night bearable. He would continue to build perfection, one joint at a time, until the day he could build his own destiny. Occasionally broken by major social events, and in 1766 that event was the wedding of Master Thayer's daughter, Eleanor. This event provided a brief, vital window into the broader social life of the colonial artisan class. A gift of craftsmanship. For a wedding among tradesmen, the most valued gifts were those crafted by hand. Master Thayer tasked Silas with creating the central piece, a large cedar-lined hope chest or dower chest for Eleanor. This was a deep honor and a major test of Silas's skills, as the entire community of artisans would inspect it. Silas approached the project with reverence. He chose aromatic cedar for the lining, which would repel insects and protect the bride's linens and gowns. He used highly figured cherry wood for the exterior, applying intricate inlay patterns, small pieces of lighter wood, holly, set precisely into the dark cherry, a display of both artistry and patience. Working on the chest was a respite from client orders. He poured his best skill into the dovetails, ensuring the lid opened with a satisfying weight, and applied the final coat of beeswax polish until the wood glowed. The chest was not just furniture, it was a tangible symbol of security and the craft that would sustain the new couple. The celebration. The wedding reception was held in a rented hall, a rare chance for the entire workshop staff to mingle with the clients and other masters. Silas, dressed in his best, though worn, broadcloth suit, felt the shift in atmosphere. Out of the workshop, he was judged less by his production rate and more by his character and future prospects. He spoke with Eleanor's new husband, a successful tanner who ran a thriving leather business. They discussed the difficulties of securing raw materials and the high cost of transportation, issues that bound all tradesmen together. It was here, amidst the celebration, that the conversation inevitably turned to the increasingly oppressive political situation. The passage of the Stamp Act had been met with fury and boycotts in Philadelphia, disrupting commerce and making life difficult for every tradesman. The king demands that every contract, every newspaper, even every deck of cards bear his seal and his tax, argued a stout tailor. How can we conduct trade when the very paper we use to write commissions is taxed into possibility? They strangle our business. Silas listened. The tax meant that Master Thayer's ledgers and contracts were now more expensive, cutting further into his already thin profit margins. The artisan class, reliant on commerce and contracts, felt the sting of external control keenly. They saw themselves as the backbone of the colonial economy and felt slighted by a distant power that neither understood nor respected their contributions. A new commission and a decision. Mr. Sterling, impressed by the quick delivery and quality of the mahogany chest, visited the shop again, not for furniture, but for a new, more urgent commission. "Thayer, I need your finest, most inconspicuous work," Sterling said, his voice low and serious. "I am part of a political action group. We need hidden compartments built into several crates to safely smuggle certain materials, pamphlets, documents, and maybe some French weaponry past the customs house." Master Thayer hesitated. This was not a simple commission. It was an act of explicit political defiance and smuggling. Discovery meant ruin, perhaps even jail. He looked at Silas, who had been listening intently. Silas was his best hand, capable of building joins so seamless they were invisible. "I will do it, Master Thayer," Silas said, stepping forward, making the decision for them both. "The Stamp Act is an offense to the honest tradesmen. If they will not respect our commerce, we will hide it." Master Thayer studied Silas's determined face.
He saw not just a skilled journeyman, but a man choosing his side in the brewing conflict. "Very well, Silas. This will be your project alone. Use the cheapest pine. It must look crude and accidental. The compartments must be invisible to the eye and to the probing bayonet. Get to work." Silas returned to his bench, but his purpose had changed. He was no longer just building chests for wealth. He was building concealment for rebellion. His chisels and planes, once tools of trade, were now becoming instruments of revolution. The straight line he drew was no longer just for a perfect dovetail. It was the line separating liberty from tyranny. The new task of building smuggling crates elevated Silas's work from demanding craftsmanship to high-stakes espionage. The project required absolute secrecy, unparalleled precision, and a deliberate deception of the eye. Building for deception. Master Thayer insisted the crates be constructed solely by Silas, working late at night in a small locked annex of the shop. This work was dangerous and highly specialized. The key was the false bottom, a compartment engineered to utilize the empty space between the base of the crate and the runners on which it rested. This gap, normally about 3 inches, had to be used without increasing the external dimensions, which would immediately raise suspicion at the customs house. Silas used cheap, rough-sawn pine, deliberately making the exterior look hastily constructed, the opposite of his normal perfect work. The interior, however, was a masterpiece of hidden joinery. He created a shallow box that fit precisely into the bottom space. The challenge was making it accessible while remaining invisible. Silas used sliding dovetail joints to create a panel that could be slipped out only by knowing its exact location and applying pressure at a specific point on the crate's side. The documents they were smuggling, copies of petitions and calls for resistance, were tightly rolled and placed within. The compartment then had to be filled with something ordinary, like dried beans or cheap grain, to mask the sound of hollow space if the crate was shaken. "The deception must be complete, Silas," warned Mr. Sterling during a clandestine midnight inspection. "The customs officers are skilled at finding loose panels and odd weights. You must make the hidden part look more secure than the outside." Silas felt the weight of the revolution resting on his meticulous joints. If the crates were discovered, it wouldn't just mean the loss of the documents, it would mean imprisonment for all involved. The artisan's financial wager. While risking his freedom on political work, Silas was also taking a major financial leap towards his dream of becoming a master. He had been quietly saving every spare shilling and was now ready to make a significant move. He used his accumulated savings, supplemented by the generous though risky payments from Mr. Sterling, to purchase his most crucial assets, specialized tools. He commissioned a master cutler to forge a full set of 10 high-quality chisels and invested in a rare, expensive European brass-backed saw known for its superior rigidity and precision. Tools were craftsman's capital. He did not own land or livestock. He owned his skills and the means to apply them. These new tools not only increased his speed and quality, but also served as collateral, a tangible asset he could present to a lender when he was finally ready to rent his own shop. A new apprentice. Master Thayer, sensing Silas's inevitable departure, eased his workload by bringing in a new apprentice. This new boy, young Elias, was less clumsy than Thomas, but lacked the deep motivation. Silas, now acting as the lead supervisor, had to shift his focus from purely physical labor to pedagogy. He spent his days instructing Elias in the proper technique of handling a woodblock plane. "Hold the plane firmly, but not rigidly," Silas instructed, his voice patient but firm. "Let the blade do the work. Feel the wood. Listen to the sound. If the sound is ragged, your blade is dull or your stance is wrong." Teaching required him to articulate the intuitive knowledge he had gained over 10 years. This process of explaining why a certain cut was made at a certain angle solidified his own mastery. As 1766 ended, the tension in Philadelphia was palpable. The initial joy of completing the mahogany chest was long gone, replaced by the deep, serious commitment of working in the shadow of war. Silas finished the last crate, meticulously staining the exterior to match the grime of travel. He had succeeded in his deception. Now all he could do was wait for the consequences of the revolution he was quietly building, one invisible joint at a time.
Life arrived in the spring of 1770. He had secured enough commissions, largely through the stealthy work from Mr. Sterling and word-of-mouth praise for his precise craftsmanship, to finally approach Master Thayer with his request, the masterpiece. Becoming a master was not merely about paying a fee. It was about proving one's skill, dedication, and artistic vision. The final test required Silas to design and construct a masterpiece, a single, complex item that demonstrated his complete mastery of the trade, from initial design to final finish. Silas chose to build a Queen Anne-style highboy, a tall, two-part chest of drawers renowned for its graceful cabriole legs, carved shell motif, and complex internal structure. This piece required mastery of carving, turning, using the lathe, and the most demanding joinery. He spent 4 grueling months on the piece, working after hours, often by the light of a single candle. He used the new, high-quality chisels he had bought and meticulously matched the grain of the rare black walnut he had purchased entirely on credit. The finished highboy was a triumph. The cabriole legs flowed like muscle. The shell carving on the central drawer was deep and crisp, and the drawers slid open and closed with a perfect whisper-quiet glide. The examination. The highboy was presented before a panel of 3 established master craftsmen from the Carpenters' Company, including Master Thayer. The examination was stern and meticulous. The masters inspected the structure, the finish, and the proportions. They checked the secondary wood, the cheaper pine used for internal structures, to ensure quality had not been sacrificed for show. They tested the resilience of the glue joints and the accuracy of the complex molding. Finally, the chief examiner nodded. "Silas Croft, you have demonstrated exceptional skill, knowledge of geometry, and an understanding of materials. You have met the requirements of the trade." With that, Silas was granted the status of master craftsman. The ceremony was simple, a handshake and the transfer of a certificate, but the impact was profound. He was now an owner, responsible for his own business, able to take apprentices, and allowed to vote in town affairs. The cost of independence. Silas immediately rented the small shop he had long dreamed of near the docks. The financial burden was crushing. He spent nearly all his savings on the first year's rent, lumber stock, and a down payment on his own massive workbench and lathe. He put up a simple sign above the door, S. Croft, carpet maker. However, the war, now a full-fledged conflict following the battles of Lexington and Concord, had a rapid destabilizing effect on his trade. Material shortages. The British blockade of the port meant the precious imported materials, mahogany, brass hardware, and specialized tools dried up almost overnight. The price of local woods like walnut and cherry skyrocketed due to scarcity. Labor instability. Apprentices and journeymen were leaving Philadelphia to join the Continental Army, leading to a severe shortage of skilled labor. Client wealth. Wealthy loyalists, who were the primary buyers of luxury goods, were fleeing the city, taking their custom and their money with them. Silas's first commissions were not for elegant highboys, but for crude, urgent items, gun carriages, supply boxes for the militia, and rough coffins. The tools of his trade, once used for beauty, were now dedicated to necessity and war. He stared at his masterpiece highboy, which stood gleaming in the corner of his new, dusty shop. It was a testament to the quiet, stable life he had worked toward, but the revolution had exploded that stability. He was free from Master Thayer's employ, but bound by the demands of a nation at war. The pursuit of perfection would have to wait. Survival and the revolutionary cause now required speed and utility. The demands of the Revolutionary War completely redefined Silas Croft's business and his role within Philadelphia. The market for luxury goods vanished. The demand for military necessities was insatiable. Silas, the meticulous carpet maker, became an integral part of the city's wartime arsenal. From dovetails to drums, Silas's shop no longer produced highboys and secretaries. His primary contracts now came directly from the Continental Army's quartermaster. His skill set, precision with wood, knowledge of stress points, and the ability to work quickly with common materials was suddenly invaluable. He quickly adapted his techniques. Instead of the elegant, time-consuming dovetails, he now relied on robust, quickly assembled lap joints, reinforced with iron bracing provided by the local blacksmith, Mr. Jenkins. He used thick pine and oak readily available from local forests, sacrificing beauty for utility. The rhythmic sounds in the shop changed. The delicate whir of the lathe was replaced by the constant clang of the hammer and the loud rasping zzz of the ripsaw cutting through thick oak boards. Working for the Army brought a new set of difficulties that surpassed the challenges of debt. Payment risk. The Continental Congress paid in continental currency, paper money that rapidly depreciated. Silas often had to accept payment in near-worthless paper, or sometimes in promises of future gold. He was essentially funding the revolution through his labor. Labor instability. With skilled hands off fighting, Silas was forced to take on more apprentices and often hired unskilled labor, elderly men and even women, to perform tasks like sanding and simple assembly. He had to simplify his designs further to accommodate the lower skill level. Tool wear. The constant brutal hammering and sawing of hard oak and pine for military supplies rapidly dulled and damaged his precious tools. Tool maintenance, once a quiet, reflective task, became a frantic necessity. Silas, however, found a deep, grim satisfaction in the work. He was no soldier, but his shop was fighting the war. Every well-made powder chest meant the troops could hold the line. Every sturdy wagon wheel he repaired kept the supply lines moving. The civic duty. Silas, now a property-owning master, was also expected to participate in the local civil defense. He was appointed to the city watch, requiring him to spend several nights a month patrolling the streets, ensuring order and looking out for spies or saboteurs, loyalists. One freezing night while patrolling near the docks, he saw a fire raging at a shipyard, likely sabotage. He and his fellow watchmen raced to the scene, fighting the blaze not with specialized equipment, but with buckets and sheer physical effort. He realized that the preservation of his city required the same vigilance and physical labor as the preservation of his own shop. His life had become entirely subsumed by the wartime effort. His dreams of building elegant furniture for wealthy patrons had faded, replaced by the essential, urgent work of survival. As he closed his shop door late one night, the smell of burning pitch and pine resin strong in his nostrils, he knew he was no longer just Silas Croft, carpet maker. He was Silas Croft, manufacturer of the Revolution.
1778, the war had reached a peak of desperation. The Continental Army, freezing and starved at Valley Forge, desperately needed everything from food and blankets to vital supplies and equipment repair. The economic strain on Philadelphia's artisans became unbearable. The siege and the scarcity. The British briefly occupied Philadelphia, disrupting all local commerce. When they retreated, they left behind a city stripped bare of resources. Silas found himself working with truly minimal means. His most difficult decision involved his tools. Iron, steel, and brass, the core materials of his precision instruments, were now critically scarce, redirected entirely toward weaponry. The Army's demands for metal became so desperate that they began petitioning citizens for anything containing brass or iron. One frigid morning, an Army quartermaster, a man Silas knew from the coffee houses, came into the shop. "Master Croft," the quartermaster said, his face etched with cold and worry. "We are short on brass for the musket locks. We need anything you can spare. Hinges, old fittings, anything." Silas looked at his prized European brass-backed saw, the one he had scrimped and saved to purchase, its solid brass spine ensuring the blade's perfect rigidity. It was the finest tool in his shop, essential for making the long, precise cuts that defined his skill. He knew he couldn't refuse. The need at Valley Forge was too great. Silas slowly unmounted the handle of the saw. The quartermaster, recognizing the sacrifice, hesitated. "Croft, this is a master's tool. I can't ask you to." "You don't ask, I offer," handing over the heavy brass spine. "The revolution needs powder, not perfectly straight molding. Tell the general that the tools of the trade are now the tools of war." He was left with older, less rigid saws with wooden or iron backs. His precision, his speed, and the overall quality of his work inevitably suffered, but the sacrifice was a profound act of patriotism. It was the physical divestment of his capital for the cause. The psychology of repair. Silas's daily work shifted again, this time from manufacturing new items to endless hurried repair work. Broken wagon wheels, split gun stocks, and damaged cannon carriages were dragged into his shop. Repair work required a different kind of skill than creation. It demanded improvisation, the ability to work around flaws, and the knowledge of how to make disparate materials hold together under stress. He was fixing, not building. The work was dirty, loud, and aesthetically jarring. The psychological toll was heavy. Silas was a craftsman who sought perfection. The war demanded quick, ugly fixes. He missed the quiet satisfaction of seeing a perfectly planed surface. He felt his skills dulling. His hands, once guided by the laws of geometry, now moved by the laws of emergency. Teaching the new generation. His apprentice, Thomas, who was now nearly out of his internship, remained loyal. Thomas saw the war as a grim necessity and took deep pride in supporting the army. Silas realized that teaching Thomas had become his most important contribution to the future of the trade. With imported books and materials impossible to get, Thomas's knowledge came only from Silas's direct instruction. Silas began dedicating his precious free hours to instructing Thomas on the principles he had once mastered: the geometry of the arch, the stability of the stress-bearing frame, and the conservation of precious tools. He was ensuring that even if the war destroyed the tools and the market, the knowledge and the standard of the craft would survive through the next generation. As 1778 drew to a close, Silas Croft stood in a shop filled with rough lumber, broken equipment, and the constant fear of inadequate payment. He had sacrificed his craft's elegance for the nation's survival. He was poorer, more exhausted, and his hands were rougher than ever, but he had mastered the ultimate craft of the revolutionary artisan: resilience. The grinding years of the war finally yielded to a fragile peace. In 1783, news of the Treaty of Paris arrived in Philadelphia, igniting a joyous, chaotic celebration that swept through the city's streets. The war was won, the colonies were free, and the immediate, terrifying demands on the artisan ceased. The peace and the rebuilding. Silas Croft, now in his late 30s, stood in the wreckage of his shop. The victory felt less like a triumph and more like the end of a long, desperate labor. His shop was scarred by the hard work of war. The floors were gouged, his workbench stained with powder grease, and his once elegant tools were worn and mismatched. The immediate post-war period presented a unique economic challenge: the sudden return to a civilian economy. The new demand was no longer for war chests, but for the basic material infrastructure of a new republic. Silas's first contracts were for building crucial civic and commercial elements.
strong, elegant office desks for the fledgling government, sturdy seating for the assembly halls, and well-made cabinetry for the merchants eager to restart international trade. The nation was literally building its government, and Silas was building the furniture to fill its offices. The legacy of the journeyman. The greatest asset Silas retained was his fully trained apprentice, Thomas, now officially freed from his indentureship. Thomas, who had matured fighting the war from the workbench, immediately became Silas's journeyman. Silas now had the skilled labor he desperately needed. He and Thomas worked side by side, teaching the new apprentices, young boys whose fathers had been lost in the war, the discipline of the craft. Silas emphasized the importance of using local woods and ingenuity, lessons learned from the years of blockade. The era of imported mahogany and brass was slowly replaced by the American style, furniture crafted from beautiful, locally sourced walnut, maple, and cherry, with simpler, strong designs reflecting the new nation's utilitarian ideals. Silas secured a large commission, building the furniture for a new Philadelphia bank. This job required him to return to his highest skill, precision and geometry, to build the bank's teller counter and security desks. As he worked on a sturdy walnut desk, planing the surface until it shone, he felt the familiar, soothing rhythm of the wood and the tool. He had to use a heavier, iron-backed saw to make the cut. The brass-backed saw was now part of some continental musket lock, but the resulting line was still perfectly straight. He realized that the war had not dulled his skills, it had refined his purpose. He now knew why he sought perfection, not for the vanity of the wealthy, but because accurate, honest craftsmanship provided the foundation for a stable society. The true masterpiece. Years later, Silas Croft was one of the most respected master craftsmen in Philadelphia, a founding member of the newly reorganized Mechanics' Society. He was prosperous, respected, and often commissioned for work by the leading figures of the new nation. One afternoon, he looked over his busy workshop. Thomas was running the lathe, the apprentices were sweeping, and the scent of sawdust and beeswax was thick and comforting. His original Queen Anne highboy, the one he built to earn his master status, stood proudly in his own home, a symbol of the skill and peace he had fought for. But his true masterpiece was not the elegant highboy. It was the shop itself, a self-sufficient, skilled, and resilient enterprise that had survived the most violent upheaval in colonial history, and was now literally building the material culture of the American Republic. The colonial artisan who fought with his hands and his specialized knowledge had secured his place as a foundational figure of the new nation. The line was straight, the joint was true, the Republic endured.
O'Neill homestead, there was no machine to spin the wool, no pipe to bring the water, no store to sell the bread. Survival was not bought, it was made, day by relentless day, by the steady hands of the family. Every chore was a thread in the rope of existence, a knot tied tightly against the wilderness, the cold, and the endless necessity of labor. To be a woman in 18th century America was to be the commander-in-chief of domestic production, and the work began before the sun ever dared to rise. The first sound of the day at the homestead of the Pembroke family was not the rooster's crow, but the scraping of flint on steel. Ilara Pembroke, 32, was up before 4:30 a.m. in their modest Connecticut farmhouse. Her husband, Thomas, and their 3 children were still asleep, cocooned in thick woolen blankets upstairs. Her duties began immediately at the hearth, the true heart of the home, which had to be carefully managed through the night. The first essential chore was fire tending. Ilara knelt, raked the glowing embers from the pile of ashes or the banked fire, added small pieces of tinder, and blew gently until the flames caught. Letting the fire die completely meant the loss of precious time and the painful process of striking a spark to start anew. Fire was life, and its maintenance was her first commandment. The morning production line. Once the fire was roaring, the morning production line began. Every woman in colonial America was a master of multiple trades. Water and lie. Ilara's next task was procuring water. She carried her heavy wooden yoke and 2 buckets to the well, the cold air stinging her face. She often hauled several gallons before the sun was even up. Water for cooking, water for washing, and most importantly, water for the simmering pot of lye soap she would work on later. The bread of life. By 5 o'clock, she began preparing the day's first meal. Breakfast was typically a simple porridge or bread and milk, but the bread for the day needed to be addressed. Ilara mixed the sourdough starter she had kept alive for years, kneading the dough by hand in a wooden bowl. This physically demanding chore was a daily necessity. The family consumed a tremendous amount of bread. When Thomas and the children finally came down, the house was warm, and the smells of cooking and smoke permeated the air. Their 3 children, 9-year-old Lydia, 6-year-old Samuel, and toddler baby Rose, were immediately put to work. Children's duties. In a colonial family, childhood was a brief period that ended with the ability to work. Children were vital, unpaid labor. Lydia's charge. Lydia, the eldest, helped her mother with the spinning wheel, but her first morning task was to churn the butter. She sat on a low stool, steadily plunging the dash up and down in the churn, a monotonous but essential chore. Samuel's charge. Samuel's primary morning duty was caring for the livestock within the yard's fence. He fed the chickens, collected their eggs, and helped Thomas milk the single cow. Thomas, the farmer, would head out to the fields or barn after a quick breakfast. His chores, plowing, planting, butchering, and building, were physically separate from the house, but dependent on Ilara's indoor production. If Ilara failed to process the food, spin the wool, or mend the clothes, Thomas's work in the field was worthless. As the sun finally cleared the trees, casting weak light through the tiny window panes, Ilara was already tackling the mountain of chores ahead. The day was not a matter of choice, it was a matter of survival, structured by the unforgiving cycle of the seasons and the constant necessity of making every single thing the family needed. The hearth was roaring, the butter was churning, and the colonial family's endless workday had begun. The core of the colonial woman's labor revolved around textiles. Without manufactured cloth, the family was naked, and without thread, every rip or tear meant immediate loss of vital clothing. The Pembroke homestead was a factory of fiber production. The tyranny of the fleece. By late morning, after the morning chores were largely complete, Ilara moved to her most demanding daily chore, spinning. The wool from their small flock of sheep had been cleaned, carded, combed into parallel fibers by Lydia, and was now ready for the wheel. Ilara sat at her spinning wheel, a heavy wooden machine that dominated a corner of the main room. The work was endless and repetitive. Her foot worked the treadle, her left hand pulled and teased the fibers, and her right hand guided the thread onto the spindle. The low, hypnotic whir of the wheel was the soundtrack to colonial domestic life. Goal. Ilara had a production quota in her mind to spin enough thread each day to produce a certain number of yards of homespun cloth for the family's annual clothing needs. If she slackened, the family wore rags in the winter. The linen cycle. They also grew flax, which was painstakingly processed, retting, soaking, scutching, and hackling the fibers. This provided the finer linen thread used for shirting and summer garments, a process far more tedious than wool processing. Lydia worked alongside her mother, often carding wool or practicing on a smaller handheld spindle. The moment a girl could manage the wheel, she was considered a full contributor to the household economy. The science of the root cellar.
The second great pillar of Ilara's midday work was food preservation and inventory. With no refrigeration, every piece of food had to be carefully stored and monitored. Ilara made a daily trip to the root cellar, a damp, cool space beneath the floorboards. Here she inspected their winter stores, barrels of salted pork and pickled vegetables, shelves of preserved jams, and bins of root vegetables buried in sand to prevent them from drying out or freezing. Candle making. Fat was a precious commodity. The melted fat rendered from butchered animals was poured into molds to create tallow candles. This was a messy, smelly, but necessary chore, as light was expensive and vital for evening work. Soap making. The leftover fat was used to make lye soap. She had to carefully filter the lye, potassium hydroxide, from the wood ash and combine it with the rendered fat, a process that required a fine balance of caustic chemicals and heat. A bad batch meant scratchy, ineffective soap. A good batch meant hygienic survival. Dinner and domestic arithmetic. The midday meal, or dinner, was the largest and most important meal of the day, sustaining the family through the heavy afternoon labor. Preparing the dinner was an exercise in domestic arithmetic. Ilara had to calculate how many meals the salted fish or the dried peas had to last until the next harvest, balancing immediate hunger against future scarcity. Dinner was often one-pot meal, such as a thick stew or baked beans, requiring hours of slow simmering in a kettle hung over the fire. Ilara's constant presence near the hearth allowed her to simultaneously manage the cooking, the soap batch, and her spinning wheel. The family ate quickly, often in silence, acutely aware that the work was waiting. As Thomas and the children returned to their fields and chores, Ilara and Lydia began the time-consuming process of cleaning up, ensuring every wooden bowl and pewter spoon was scrubbed, polished, and ready for the next use. There was no rest. There was only the transition from one essential chore to the next.
For chores that demanded focused attention, often involving the meticulous maintenance of clothing and the essential task of managing the family's fragile health. The constant battle against wear. Clothing was extremely valuable, a substantial investment of material and labor. Nothing was discarded until it was completely worn out, and its constant repair was a high-priority chore for Ilara. Mending and patching. After dinner cleanup, Ilara would take up her sewing basket. Every afternoon was spent addressing the inevitable wear and tear. Thomas's breeches needed patching from the rough farm work. Lydia's shift needed darning at the elbow. She used simple, strong linen thread and the smallest pieces of saved cloth to make her repairs. A good seamstress ensured clothes lasted for years, passed down through the children until the fabric was too thin to patch further. Making the basics. Ilara also worked on the continuous production of basics. She cut and stitched simple linen shifts and undergarments, which required less complex patterns than the outer garments, ensuring the family had enough layers for warmth. The chore of cleanliness. Washing clothes was one of the most physically exhausting chores of the colonial household, a task usually relegated to 1 or 2 long days every month, rather than a daily routine. When a wash day arrived, Ilara and Lydia would boil the clothes in a massive kettle, scrubbing them with their homemade lye soap, and then beating them with a wooden paddle, a dolly, to release the dirt. The caustic lye and the heavy labor often left Ilara's hands raw and aching. The clothes were then rinsed multiple times in cold water and hung on bushes or lines to dry, bleaching slightly in the sun. The cabin floor. Daily cleanliness focused on the house itself. The rough plank floor was swept with a straw broom. In the main room, dirt and spills were common, and Ilara would periodically scatter fresh sand across the floor. This sand collected dirt and grease and was then swept out and replaced, a colonial way of cleaning the floor. The mother as healer and educator. Colonial life lacked doctors and apothecaries nearby. forcing Ilara to serve as the primary healer and medic for her family. In the late afternoon, she might tend to her herb garden, which was essential for managing minor illnesses. She knew the properties of common plants, mint for upset stomach, chamomile for sleeplessness, and comfrey for healing bruises. If someone was ill, she would prepare decoctions, tinctures, and poultices. She also managed the highly unpleasant task of cupping or bleeding when necessary, following rudimentary knowledge passed down through generations. The quiet of the late afternoon was also the time for formal instruction. Ilara, who was literate, dedicated time to teaching Lydia and Samuel to read and write. Lydia practiced reciting the catechism and reading scripture from the family Bible. Samuel practiced arithmetic, learning to calculate bushels of grain and livestock inventory, the math of survival. This domestic education was paramount, as it guaranteed the children could manage the family's economic affairs later in life. As the shadows lengthened and the daylight faded, the arduous work of mending, cleaning, and educating concluded. The scent of drying herbs and wood smoke filled the room, and Ilara prepared for the next wave of chores, the milking, the gathering of eggs, and the preparation of the evening meal. The cycle of labor was relentless, allowing no moment for true rest until the final ember of the hearth was banked for the night. The colonial family was the fundamental economic unit, and its efficiency rested entirely on the strict, often unspoken division of labor along gender lines. The boundary between Thomas's work and Ilara's work was absolute. The outside and the inside economy. Thomas, the outside economy. His domain was the field, the forest, and the large animals. He managed the heavy seasonal tasks, plowing in spring, harvesting in fall, felling trees, building fences, and tending the oxen and horses. His work was physically brutal and often solitary. Ilara, the inside economy. Her domain was the home, the garden, and the domestic animals, chickens, milk cow. Her labor was continuous and specialized, manufacturing food, textiles, medicine, and managing the domestic finances, the accounting of goods. Her labor was less seasonal and more day-to-day, providing the constant, essential support structure for Thomas's work. The evening transition. As the sun set, the labor of the two economies would temporarily merge. Thomas would return from the fields, often bringing the raw materials for Ilara's next day, a load of wood fire he had split, or maybe a deer he had hunted. Wood management. Firewood was the blood life of the household, and its management was a shared responsibility. Thomas would split and stack the wood outside, but Ilara and Lydia were responsible for bringing the necessary armloads inside to feed the hearth constantly. Milking and dairy. Milking the cow was often a shared task. While Thomas might handle the milking, the processing of that milk, skimming the cream, churning the butter, or making soft cheese fell entirely to Ilara. This transition time was also when Thomas could turn his hand to specific domestic repairs that required specialized male strength or tools, such as fixing a loose hinge on the cellar door or sharpening the axes Ilara used for chopping kindling. The supper ritual. The supper, the evening meal, was less substantial than the midday dinner, often consisting of leftovers or a simple hash. It was the only meal where the entire family could sit together for an extended period, sharing not just food, but information. The conversation revolved around the day's production. "The flax is nearly ready for retting, Ilara," Thomas might say, providing Ilara with a timeline for her next major textile task. "We must butcher a pig before the next full moon," Ilara might respond, signaling that the salted pork stores were running low. This communication was vital to the smooth running of their economic unit. There was no room for miscommunication. A failure to plan meant a failure to survive. The final chores and education. After supper, the children had their final domestic duties. Lydia cleaned the pewter and polished the tinware, and Samuel carried the night's supply of water from the well.
When darkness completely settled, the family relied on the dim, flickering light of their precious tallow candles. It was too dark and dangerous to work with tools, so the final hour was spent on quiet, continuous labor or collective learning. Ilara continued to knit stockings or repair garments that didn't require fine visual precision. Thomas might read from the Bible or a practical almanac by the fireside. This evening pause was critical for socializing and maintaining family bonds, the only time where the demands of the inside and outside economies were set aside. At an hour considered shockingly early by modern standards, the family prepared for bed, extinguishing the candles and banking the fire. Ilara's final task was always the same, checking the banked fire one last time, ensuring the glowing embers were safely nestled under the ash. She was preparing for tomorrow's first chore, guaranteeing that the cycle of ceaseless labor would start efficiently the moment she woke. The rhythm of the colonial family was simply the rhythm of necessity, repeated every day.
Though continuous, swelled and subsided dramatically according to the seasons. No time was more demanding than late summer and early fall, the season of harvest and preservation. This period determined whether the family would eat well or starve during the harsh winter. The labor of plenty. The moment the grain fields were cleared by Thomas, Ilara's indoor labor doubled and specialized intensely. All non-essential spinning and mending were set aside. The primary focus shifted to processing perishable goods. Vegetable processing. The large garden plot, largely Ilara and Lydia's domain throughout the year, now yielded a massive bounty of beans, corn, squashes, and root vegetables. The immediate task was drying. Beans were shelled and spread on sheets in the sun. Corn was shucked and hung in long braids, corn strings, from the rafters of the main room, where the heat and smoke from the fire would slowly cure them. Pickling and brining. Ilara spent days preparing brines and vinegar solutions. Cucumbers and cabbage, for sauerkraut, were submerged in massive crocks. This process was essential, as pickled items provided vital vitamins during the months when fresh food was unavailable. Fruit and sweeteners. Any excess apples or berries were quickly processed. Ilara boiled down fruit with precious, expensive molasses, often imported from the West Indies, to create preserves and jellies. Sugar was a luxury, so every fruit had to be maximally reduced to keep it from spoiling. The butchering crisis. The most difficult and intense communal labor occurred during the butchering in late autumn, usually right before the first hard frost. This was a messy, fast-paced, and highly specialized process that involved the entire family. Thomas took the lead on the slaughtering, but the immediate, hours-long processing fell heavily on Ilara. Sausage and lard. Ilara and Lydia had to quickly render the fat into lard, used for cooking and candle making, and grind the meat for sausages. Salting and smoking. The primary means of preserving meat was salting. Massive amounts of salt, another expensive import, were rubbed into the pork and beef. The meat was then packed into brine barrels or hung in the smokehouse for long-term storage. This work had to be completed within a single day. If the processing was too slow, the precious meat could spoil, representing a catastrophic loss of winter food. The entire family worked past exhaustion, the house filled with the smell of blood, smoke, and salt. Preparing for the cold. As the stores were secured in the root cellar and the smokehouse, Ilara's focus shifted to preparing the house itself for the cold. Insulation. The house was drafty. Ilara would stuff wool scraps or rags into cracks around the window frames and door jambs to minimize heat loss. Bedding. She checked the straw in the mattresses, ensuring it was fresh and thick. She also inspected every blanket, making sure every wool garment was mended and ready for winter use.
The harvest season, though bringing the joy of successful survival, meant the most demanding, least forgiving work. For a few short months, the family lived in a frenzy of production, driven by the absolute necessity of storing up enough goods, both food and textiles, to last through the dark, cold, and often isolating winter. Their success was measured by the bounty filling their cellar and the warmth of the clothes on their backs. While the Pembroke household operated as an isolated unit for much of the year, colonial life was fundamentally communal. Certain massive chores were simply impossible or dangerously inefficient to execute alone, necessitating reliance on neighbors and the structure of the community. The labor bee. The most visible sign of this communal reliance was the bee, a gathering of neighbors to accomplish a heavy task quickly. Quilting bees, for women, were the most common gathering. Once Ilara had spun the yarn and woven the cloth, the pieces had to be sewn into usable blankets. Neighbors would gather in the Pembroke home, bringing their needles and thimbles. While the older women expertly stitched the layers of batting and cloth together, the process was fueled by gossip, shared news, and laughter, a rare break from the isolation of the farm. Barn raisings and butchering. For Thomas, the communal events involved heavy construction or harvesting. A barn raising was a huge community effort that saw dozens of men haul and lift the massive timbers into place, often completed in a single exhausting day. In return, Ilara would spend days preparing vast amounts of food and drink to feed the assembled crew. This system was an unwritten contract. You gave your labor when asked, and in return you received help in your own time of need. To refuse aid was a risk of being isolated, a socially and economically devastating position. The burden of hospitality. Hospitality was not a luxury, it was a civic and Christian duty. Because travel was slow and inns were scarce, travelers, whether clergy, soldiers, or passing relatives, relied on the generosity of homesteads like the Pembrokes. When a guest arrived, Ilara's domestic workload immediately increased. Extra food. The guest had to be fed the best provisions the family could spare. This meant baking extra bread and drawing on the most carefully guarded reserves of preserved meat. Cleaning and comfort. Beds had to be prepared, linen aired, and the main room made spotless. This was done even if the guest arrived late and unannounced. The presence of guests, though demanding, also brought crucial connections. Guests often carried letters, news from distant cities, Boston or New York, and ideas about politics and changing fashion, a vital link to the outside world that broke the monotony of daily chores. The role of bartering. While Thomas dealt in large-scale bartering, trading grain for tools, Ilara managed the small-scale domestic bartering network among the women. She might trade a few yards of her high-quality linen thread to a neighbor who specialized in making candles, or exchange a jar of her spiced preserves for a medicinal herb she couldn't grow herself. This network of exchange provided immediate, practical needs that cash often could not supply. It reinforced the women's collective control over the domestic economy, ensuring that skill, not just money, was a reliable source of goods. The community, bound together by mutual necessity, transformed the relentless labor of colonial survival into a shared experience. The chores were still demanding, but the occasional company made the burdens, like the heavy quilting frame or the massive butchering day, significantly lighter.